Let's get into some games here before we get to the college football reactions. Joe, Minnesota versus Oregon. Oregon coming off a thriller in Iowa. Minnesota a couple of weeks ago ending the college football playoff chances for teams like Nebraska. When you preview this team and you preview these teams and preview this game, what are your thoughts with Oregon versus Minnesota?
Oregon is a 6.5-point favorite in this game for Friday night at Oregon. Blake, I know that this performance that Oregon had against Iowa, it was frustrating to watch on the offensive side. They're in a very difficult position with their wide receiver talent because of the injuries that they've endured. To this point, Dan Lanning did not provide an update on the situation with DeLeone and Moore and if there's going to be any reinforcements coming. Blake, I think the first and foremost important thing for this matchup is I see an easy opportunity for Oregon to win this game and to potentially cover that number because of the way that they ran the ball when they needed to most against Iowa. We saw Whittington, Davison, and Hill Jr. They've had multiple great games, but they ran all over Iowa for 261 yards. They're stepping into a game, and this is the most important thing of this matchup, Blake, against a Memphis run defense that is 84th in the country in EPA per rush allowed. They are giving up a lot of big plays on the ground. It happened multiple times this season. We saw it against Iowa. We saw it against Michigan State in their last game. This Minnesota team started hot, but it feels like over the last couple of weeks, they've cooled down tremendously, setting up Oregon for what should be a handed victory.
So, look, when Heatherman left Minnesota, I thought a lot of us asked the question of how Minnesota would react defensively. Well, Joe, they're 21st in the country in total defense. They're 21st in the country in rushing, 21st in the country in rushing offense. Not that matters to Oregon because Iowa last week was second in the country in run defense, and they ran all over them. So Minnesota, just don't think that they're not going to be able to walk in there and run all over you. Their secondary's been a little bit iffy in moments and times, but this Minnesota defense plays very tough. And I wonder with a struggling pass defense that statistically is the worst that they do from a defensive side of things, if it's not beneficial to Oregon that you have some guys nicked up. Now, Oregon's going to have to find some players and find them quickly when it comes to guys on the outside, very quickly. And I don't know what's going to happen there. You know, I told you I asked around to some people with my connections to DeLeone and Moore. I don't know if his status this week. However, what I do know is it doesn't seem as bad as maybe some anticipated that it was last week. However, with all of that being said, Joe, I do look at Oregon and say to myself, look, I just don't know if Minnesota offensively can keep up. They're 118th in the country in total offense. They're 121st in the country in rushing offense. And you're going up against the number one secondary statistically in the country in passing yards allowed in Oregon. This feels and seems like a matchup that is made for disaster when it comes to Minnesota. Oregon is, after scathing through last week versus Iowa, I'm really, really interested to see how a young team, a very young team, who yet again, on the last second play of a game in the Big Ten on the road, who found a way to win, Joe, they just keep doing it. Like I think of Penn State, you finding a way to do it on the last play. You found a way to do it against Iowa on the last play. How much confidence is this young team building, and how much does that translate in the game versus Minnesota?
No, absolutely. And I think that that's a really good question to be asking is that translation. I think, Blake, another aspect to this, why I really have a lot of faith in Oregon. There's a bunch of games that we could talk about this week where there's potential upset opportunities. The Miami-NC State game, I think, is going to be a really interesting one for that discussion. We're going to get to the Iowa-USC game. I don't think that this one does. I think that Minnesota is trending backward. I don't think that they're going to play spoiler like they did with Nebraska. Their last two performances have been incredibly, incredibly troubling. I'm just so impressed by the way that Oregon's run defense, their front seven, stepped up against Iowa. Of all teams, they stepped up against Iowa. Minnesota's got a solid offensive line. but they have had a ton of issues offensively, especially as of late. 126th in EPA per rush. They're just not having any juice in the run game whatsoever. I know that they've had injuries at running back, and it's kind of depleted their ability to get full production there. But man, Blake, I feel like that this Minnesota team just does not have much to turn to. I really like some of the guys that they have on their defensive line and in their own front seven. I'm a big fan of Anthony Smith, who's got 11.5 tackles for loss on the year. He's got 8.5 sacks. He's quietly one of the best defensive linemen in the country. Mm-hmm. But outside of that, Drake Lindsay's cooled down quite a bit, and I feel like that they just don't have enough to keep up with this even banged up Oregon team. Where are they supposed to find an edge? There's just not very many areas that they're going to be able to sneak up on Oregon after they had what should be considered to be an impressive win against Iowa.
Especially when you just can't run or throw the football.
Yeah.
I mean, look, we just saw Oregon come out of a game where because of weather and because of situations, Dante Moore did not have the viable options that he normally would have. And, Joe, they still won. How? They just ran the football all over one of the better defenses in the country, and it didn't matter. Now, I will say this. You can't keep getting 3. You're going to have to find a way in the red zone to start getting these things into 7. Now, I go back to Penn State. I go back to Iowa. You got to convert in the red zone. Statistically, they're phenomenal there, right? But at the same time, my eyes can see the 2 closest games that you play. Actually, the 3 closest games that you played, one of them you lost. You didn't convert all the times that you needed to in the red zone, right? Like, Joe, I think of Iowa, I think of Indiana, and I think of Penn State. You got to go get 7. You can't go get 3. The biggest mismatch in this one, though, Joe, you talk about the offense. You talked about the banged up running back room too, but they can't run the ball. They can't run the ball in Minnesota. I understand it. This just isn't a team, and you're not built for a situation where you can throw it. Joe, we constantly come out here every single week and look at games and say, that team's biggest weakness, that team's biggest strength. It matches up perfectly in this one. That's why it's probably going to be close.
Right.
Like it happens every single week. Can Minnesota what is the one thing that all of these games that top teams, when they've been close, what do they all have in common? The team that suffocated the time of possession, like Arkansas almost clipped A&M. I mean, Ohio State hadn't really been tested because they just blowing out everybody. So there's that. You look at Alabama. What did Florida State do? What did South Carolina do when they almost got clipped? What did Ole Miss do to Oklahoma? Look at the games around the country and these games being close. By the way, what did Penn State do to Indiana last week? Mm-hmm. They all held on to the football and made the teams that are highly ranked in them tackle in space. You've seen it with Bama. You've seen it with Indiana. You saw it with Oregon last week. Can Minnesota find a way to just keep a banged-up Oregon team off the field and try to make this a 24-21 type of game and see if they can't knock them off that way? I don't see it going that way. I think at some point this young Oregon team's going to break through against one of these conference opponents and blast them. And I don't know if it's not this week. Iowa just wasn't the situation where that, with the weather and everything, I thought that they still could do it then. Is it going to be this week? It's just this game is built to go down in a situation where I think Oregon not only wins, Joe, I think they cover.
I'm surprised by the line being this close, and I think that maybe that there's a little bit of
what do they know that what does here know that we don't? What does FanDuel know that we don't?
I think that they're assuming the issues with the injuries at wide receiver and not having DK Moore. And we saw the impact that the passing game was just not as reliable as it was in the past. They clearly had to lean on running the football. But I think the thing that they proved is that if they don't have options in their passing attack, they can just go all out onslaught running the football. And that's why, I really think 6.5 point spread. This feels like one of those Friday night games where maybe you're out at a bar or you're just hanging out in your living room and you flip it on. And you're like, oh, Oregon's up by It's 17 points right now, and then you look away and the game's just over. They just take control. They slow it down. They do their thing. They get in and get out of there. I do wonder, like in all full seriousness, this won't be the game I think it catches up to them. But at what point does this team get healthy again? Because I feel like that the slow grind down of the injury issues have turned Oregon into a version of themselves that's not as threatening as it can be, but they've got enough depth that they can survive it in the meantime.
It certainly could catch up to them against USC. 1,000% to catch up to them, because if USC finds a rhythm and you're going to have to go score for score with them, oh, good heavens to Betsy, it could get bad here. I will counteract you with one thing. You said you look up and Oregon's up by 17. You know, the last time that I looked up and a team was up 20-7, and I turned my head to play and do some things with my kids, I came back and Penn State had taken a lead on Indiana.
Minnesota's not Penn State, though. The reason that game was created and the reason why that game went the way that it did was because Penn State had the premier athletes at key positions. They had two guys that were highly regarded as elite prospects that really hadn't developed to the degree that I think everyone was hoping. But Nick Singleton took over and Denai Dennis Sutton took over. I think as good as Anthony Smith is, I think he's a really good player. He's not as physically talented, first-round draft prospect type of a guy as Denai Dennis Sutton is. And I think that he could definitely cause problems, but he's facing off with a really good Oregon offensive line and doesn't have a really elite supporting cast around him like Denai Dennis Sutton did with some of the talent that Penn State had on their defensive line. I just don't see – it was more definable to sit here and look at the Penn State game and go, that was why that game went down the way that it did. I don't know where I'm supposed to point to and say this is the hidden X factor where Minnesota sneaks up on Oregon. The injuries, is that it?
I think you might have written down the wrong spread.
Is it not 6.5?
It's 25.5.
I did write down the wrong spread. 25.5.
Yeah, Oregon minus 25.5.
I actually might still take 25. We'll be quite honest with you.
I'm not taking 25.5. I just got a text during the show, and they were like, check FanDuel with Oregon and Minnesota. I'm like, okay. Yeah, it's 25. It's 25.5. But regardless, I could see that. That makes a lot more sense. Look, I think this one's gonna get bad. The biggest strengths for Oregon still are just they're gonna overwhelm Minnesota. Give me Oregon. I don't make me pick the points right now.
I don't blame you for